I am here to try to convince you that you will have to do your marvelous work on smart cities in a totally different future than you think. And I'm going to try to convince you that you ought to use my picture of the future rather than the one you have in your mind at this time, because that's going to lead to greater success. How do I know what the future will be like? Because I've spent much more time thinking about this than you. Because I have written a long book about the future. And least of all, most of all, because I am an arrogant bastard. And I know, as opposed to you, who might think. Technically speaking, what I would like to try to respond to is this question. What is the big socioeconomic environmental context in which you will have to do your work to create the smart cities of the future? The full answer to this thing is given in the book that Torbjørn mentioned, which is called 2052. This book describes in quantitative detail what will happen over the next 40 years. I've made it in such a way that I split the world in 5 regions, made forecasts for each of the regions, summed it up to get the global forecast. What is the short answer? The short answer is that we are not in for a rosy future. The next 40 years are not going to be as nice as you think. First of all, the world economy is going to grow much more slowly over the next 40 years than you think, but still fast enough to trigger a climate crisis in the second half of the century. Global consumption will stagnate during this period because the world society will have to use much of its capital and labor on repair and adaptation to the climate change. The world GDP, and hence the number of jobs, will, however, continue to grow. But an increasing share of this work has to be repair and adaptation work, which means that consumption rates will not go up as fast as they would otherwise have done. China will outperform all other regions, the rich world will stagnate, and the poor world will remain poor. The graph, which will be here for a long while, and those of you who like graphs, look at it, and those who don't like graphs, listen to what I say. Shows the development for 5 of the 50 indicators in our analysis of what will happen over the next 40 years. What will this picture mean for urban planners in the rich world? I have 10 points. There are 10 things, 10 trends that you ought to consider when planning for the most smart cities of the future. The first of them is that there will be slower economic growth in the next 40 years than over the last 40 years. The main reason for this is that the industrial economies are mature. It means that people already largely work in services and care, sectors which are very difficult to rationalisere, to increase productivity in. There will be ever less manufacturing and simple office works, which can be where productivity increase is relatively simple. What this will lead to is increased friction between the unemployed youth and us retired people receiving a pension from those that are at work. And the slow growth will also increase the emphasis on redistribution, taking from the rich and giving to the poor. The second point that you need to take into account is the fact that the population will grow in the rich world much more slowly than most people think. It will actually decline. Why? Because the women of the rich world will continue to choose a career rather than more children, and that's essentially the main reason. So it's a voluntary decline in the population. This will lead to the obvious fact that there will be many more old and many fewer young in the society, and it will lead to the fact that most people, or there will be many more one-person households than there has been in the past. The third thing you need to consider is that in spite of the slowing or even decline of the national populations, the populations of urban areas will grow very rapidly over the next 40 years. Why? Because people like to live in cities. They prefer, that's where the action is, that's where the action will be. And so they will voluntarily move to the city. This will be accelerated by the fact that we will have more and more dual profession couples, and in order to get an interesting job for both spouses, you need a big economy, you need a big city. And thirdly, immigration will be a strong force, and people don't migrate in order to live in the countryside, they accumulate in the cities. So we will have declining national populations and rapidly growing urban populations. The fourth point I'm going to make is that urbanization is going to be accelerated by climate change. Why? Because, first of all, cities are more energy efficient. Having people collected in one place is more energy efficient than having them all around. The same goes for the climate efficiency. There are lower transport needs when people live densely together, and it is also cheaper to defend cities against climate change than it is to defend the outlying farm. My fifth point is that there will be more frequent extreme weather in this next 40 years, which from an urban planning point of view means basically that you have to handle more extreme weather, rain, etc. But coastal erosion and landslides are the two things that one ought to think most about, from rain and from melting permafrost. And these things will increasingly be seen as a problem over this period of time, which means that cities, if they expand, will expand inland and away from steep slopes, in order to be safer in this period. Much more resources will be spent on adaptation, trying to get used to the intense rain downpour, to the fact that the coastline is moving, etc., which means that repair work will be a growth sector. It will actually be quite good for construction, over the next 40 years. Which reminds me that I forgot to stress the fact that when I'm talking about these trends, these are not things that will happen next week, next 6 months, next 6 years. These are general developments that will occur gradually over the next generation. Sixth point, there will be a continued focus on energy efficiency and renewable energy. Coal, oil, and gas will disappear from the scene, not totally by 2050, but clearly that is the direction. Interesting aspects of this is that cars are likely to be emission-free at the time, which interestingly has the effect that all this push for public transport, partly because of climate reasons, will disappear. There will be other reasons why you want to have buses and trains, but not because they're more climate efficient. The seventh point, the wilderness, the untouched wilderness, will disappear during this period. We will cut down most of the trees and have tourists in most other places. So the undisturbed wilderness will disappear, which is interesting because it will reduce the fascination with living in the rural area and actually further accelerate the urbanization trend. 8, there will be fewer attractive tourist destinations in the future. Both natural treasures and cultural treasures will be increasingly destroyed by tourists. When you want to have a look at the art in Florence, that will be fine. The art will still be there, but there will be a couple of 100 million new middle-class people from China in line in front of you. So it's not that easy to get to it. And most natural beauty will, of course, be destroyed by the same hundreds of millions of additional middle-class people, in addition to the hundreds of millions that are already doing their utmost, destroying the coral reefs and the wildernesses. Ninth point, virtual reality will replace the real thing. You know, this is happening already on the entertainment scene or even on the tourist scene, where you would typically, instead of going to a rainforest to look at some extinct animal, you turn on the National Geographic channel and you look. You know, do virtual tourism is actually, nature tourism is actually much better, more pleasant and less terrorist. The same thing goes, of course, for digital communication, work, education, and interestingly, social interaction. You know, Facebook is only the beginning of the digitization of social interaction between people. This is going to move very far over the planning period. And finally, there will be a shift towards more focus on well-being. You know, we're facing now a generation where income growth will actually not occur in spite of us trying very hard. And it hopefully will be a situation where one then focuses on trying to increase the well-being of people given stable incomes rather than the continuous pursuit of after-tax income growth. But again, I remind you, this is not 6 months, next 6 months, it's not the next 6 years. This is, you know, the general sweep over the next 30 to 40 years. So my conclusion is that if you have a plan of any type, make sure that it works under these 10 conditions listed here. And also, you should remember that the future is, for urban planners, is probably going to look much more like this picture than perhaps what you have in mind. The smart city will be in the flatlands, not near hills where you can get landslides and other problems. It will be hunkered down. These will not be structures that stands up in the strong and extreme winds. These will be things that you try to hide in the environment. They will be far away from the ocean, as far as possible from the sea level rise, which is actually going to cause a lot of difficulty over this period. Again, you know, this is not tomorrow, it's not 6 years in the future, but it is, you know, on the 40-year type of horizon for which you are working. Finally, anything special about Norway, because what I've said is generally true for the European and Australian and even American situation. Anything special about Norway? And yes, there is. Because centralization in this country is going to become the dominant political force over the next 40 years. That means that the political agenda will be increasingly determined by urban well-being. And this is, of course, for Norway, a huge shift from the fascination over the last 30 to 60 years on improving living conditions in the rural areas. You know, over the next 30 to 40 years, you'll see that interest in supporting the districts, you know, giving in, you know, for a much more central focus on the urban life. So the way I'd hope to say that, or like to say this, is basically that smart cities will, over the next 40 years, become a much more politically correct word than, you know, improved livability in the rural Norway. Thank you very much.